Senator Housakos.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Chers collègues, je vais parler aujourd'hui des défis économiques.
Colleagues, today I will talk about the unprecedented economic challenges Canadians are facing in the context of this world pandemic. Too often in this chamber, we have used the word crisis to describe events and challenges which we've had to overcome as a country, but I believe that this word perfectly describes the situation the world is facing today. In fact, I think it's impossible to exaggerate the economic dislocation and the shock which Canadians are all confronting today.
That it expects Canada to lose 2.8 million jobs in March and April alone. Prior to this crisis, Canada had a national unemployment rate of 5%. That rate is now 20% and expected to rise significantly. Dans ma province du Québec, on a perdu.
In my home province of Quebec, we've lost 264,000 jobs in March only. The unemployment rate has jumped from 4.5 to 8.1%. In Canada, Ontario alone has lost more than Quebec.
In some regions of the country, the unemployment rate could actually reach a staggering level of 85%. This level of unemployment and slowdown in economic activity is unprecedented, even in comparison to other crises, notably the great market crash of 1929. We are engaging in radical surgery in order to make social distancing effective and smother the virus. Even if we are successful in maintaining effective social distancing, the virus will still kill between 11,000 and 22,000 Canadians. We have, of course, all seen projections that are even more worrisome. However, we cannot be blinded to the longer-term impacts for our economy and for the livelihood of Canadians. It is on some of these impacts that I want to focus my remarks on this evening. In the face of this global pandemic, every country is facing similar economic challenges. But I believe we need to be frank and acknowledge that some countries will be better prepared than others. And some are also responding to the economic challenges we face better than others. At a foundational level, there's the matter of how well we have positioned ourselves as a country to weather unexpected economic challenges that will inevitably arise from time to time. If one looks at the first half of the previous decade, the government of the day undertook considerable efforts to return the country to a balanced budget situation after the economic shocks of 2008 to 2009. As a result of these efforts, by 2015, the federal budget had been returned to balance. The country was well positioned to prosper and prepare for an economic downturn when and if ever it occurred. Prime Minister Stephen Harper understood that politicians do what is popular, leaders do what is right. However, in the second half of the decade, the current government embarked on a different approach. Instead of making good stewardship of an economy a priority, the government engaged in deliberate deficit spending and acted as though there could never be any bad times again. The result is, in the last half-decade, more than $100 billion has been added to federal debt. In the face of the current crisis, the Parliamentary Budget Office has calculated that the federal deficit will now reach $184 billion in just the coming year. That level of spending will be 3 times what was required in the 2009 budget, which responded to a deep recession of 2008 and 2009. However, at that time, the federal government was coming off nearly a decade of budget surpluses, of fiscal proper management. A decade ago, it was much easier to weather the storm, though it was still a significant struggle to return to a balanced budget in the years that followed. Unfortunately, the advantage we had then has been flippantly tossed aside over the past 4 years. According to projections, Canada's federal GDP to debt ratio is now set to rise to 40% from 30% in just 1 year. That's just the federal debt to GDP ratio, colleagues. Provinces carry additional debt, which, as noted in recent articles in the Financial Post, is the highest collective debt to GDP ratio in the whole world. Subnational governments in this country have unparalleled debt to GDP ratios. Colleagues, I fear that we have simply been too optimistic and too fiscally irresponsible over the past 4 years. And now the only option we have is to hope for a relatively fast global recovery to pull us out of the current crisis. Regardless of how the global economy situation plays out, This country is going to face very difficult economic and financial choices in the few years ahead. Much of that will be due to cavalier economic choices. There's nothing that could be done about bad past decisions at this point, colleagues. Unfortunately, however, I'm equally concerned about the aspects of the government's current approach. Tout d'abord, il est clair.
First, it's clear that the government has not reacted quickly enough to the crisis. On March 18, barely 3 weeks ago, the government introduced a wage subsidy of 10% for companies, which could show a loss of revenue of 30% as compared to the previous period last year. Companies largely criticized this measure, which they felt was extremely inadequate given the scope of the crisis. And we've learned since that this wage subsidy will be 5 times higher to stand at 75%, and that companies will only have to show a 15% loss of revenue. The magnitude of this change, this is not a minor change after all, shows that the government's consultation process with Canadian businesses was completely inappropriate.
Further problems, colleagues. The program is highly complex. When he testified before the House of Commons Finance Committee just this week, Dan Kelly of the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses reported that his group is getting 800 calls a day from Canadian businesses seeking to understand the complexities of eligibility requirements for the emergency wage subsidy. Kim Moody of the Canadian Tax Advisory told the committee that it will take 3 to 6 weeks for Canadian businesses to access funds under the envisaged application process. He said, and I quote him, 3 to 6 weeks is simply too long, way too long. And it is, colleagues. Those of us that have been in business knows that 6 weeks is the point of which you go bankrupt or you keep your nose above water. Similar concerns have been expressed by the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. This suggests completely inadequate consultations with Canadian business groups, colleagues. I'm sorry, but this is something we cannot afford during this crisis. The government cannot do business as they usually have, because these are not normal times. It should be working hand in glove with businesses and with a sense of urgency. There are also increasing indications that the program may have significant gaps. The Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses has reported that up to 80% of Canada's small businesses are currently shuttered. That involves a staggering total of 110,000 companies across the country. But some small and medium-sized enterprises are reportedly struggling to access needed loans. This has given rise to significant concerns that the Business Development Bank of Canada's lending criteria are just too stringent, and that they are favouring medium to large-sized businesses with already established positive cash flow. So we are certainly not responding to those that are the most in need. This could risk leaving many small businesses out in the cold, and small businesses is the foundation upon which our Canadian economy functions. All of this is very concerning, and it should be for all of us. The government has claimed that a collaborative approach is a core principle of how it plans to tackle this crisis. However, what we are seeing is not indicative of a collaborative approach.
Some people suggested in the midst of this crisis that the government should have unconditional additional powers to act without oversight or questioning of their actions by parliamentarians. However, faced with a government which rather cavalierly treats national finance for many years, and which took too long to bring about measures to help Canadian businesses, and which seems to elaborate policies without much transparency or effective consultation, while oversight becomes all the more important.
Legislation urgently. We simply have no choice. But I have some serious concerns. I can only implore the government to recommit to effective engagement and consultation with businesses and other partners in this crisis. What we are facing is unlike the crisis we've experienced during World War II. This time, the enemy is different. But the requirement for a truly national and collaborative approach between government and Canadian industry is no less the case now than it was then. Indeed, this time the survival of Canadian businesses and indeed of our national economy depends on the strength of that collaborative approach. I urge the government to recommit itself to this objective in no uncertain terms. I urge Parliament and the Senate to also insist on that in no uncertain terms. With all of that said, While I credit the government for trying to do its very best, and I do want to make it clear that I don't believe anyone is not doing likewise and working in good faith. But the bottom line is that Canada was not prepared for this pandemic. We weren't prepared on financial front, and we weren't prepared on the health front. We allowed our stockpiles of medical equipment to be depleted, and we allowed our financial stockpiles to be depleted. And this government was warned that all of their spending over the last 4 years was going to leave us in dire straits when the time came. And here we are, colleagues. So let this be a lesson once and for all. We must never, ever find ourselves in this position again. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.